Welcome. Avi, when you first started working on this documentary, did you understand how prescient the subject matter, the fact that, I mean, it gives me shivers to think of the quote that Wallace says that the first thing totalitarians attack is free press.
Yeah. No. I started working on this, I think, June 16. So it was before Trump got elected. And I remember I came to America around August. And when Trump got elected, I remember that thinking that the film became much more relevant right now. And in the time that passed, obviously, the attacks on journalism has just escalated. But I really was looking for a story about broadcast journalism. I wasn't looking to do a story about Mike when I first thought about it. So even before Trump, the journalism felt like it's in a problematic situation before he came into office. And I was kind of looking for a story that I can tell the broadcast journalism through it. And Mike has this unparalleled career in journalism. He's like a Forrest Gump character or a Zelig, that he was in all the right junction in time. And I had this idea of doing a portrait of Mike and through him tell the broadcast journalism story. So it was before Trump, but obviously Trump winning made it much more timely.
Rafael, getting the Wallace state to allow you guys to do this project, was that a difficult thing to do?
Well, they had been approached a number of times before and had never agreed to, participate or allow a project to happen. And I think it was the angle that we were looking at the story from, what Avi was just talking about, that it's a bigger story of broadcast journalism and why it's so urgent and important to be having this conversation right now, and that, the movie would be telling Mike's story, but it would be, in a bigger sense, really talking about the story of how did we get to this point in broadcast journalism. And I think both Chris Wallace, who's his son, who's an anchor on Fox News, which I'm sure most of you know, and his daughter, I think that was something that was very important to them, and I think that was why this was the first time they ever, really said, okay, we trust you guys, and we think we're gonna,
And they gave you complete access.
Well, they gave us their blessing, which then with them we went together to CBS. And because they had to open the entire 60-minute archive, which again...
That was the first time they've done anything
yes,
like this, right?
For sure. I mean, we've licensed a lot of stuff before from 60 Minutes, and it's a very difficult process. It's an incredibly expensive process, and it's a process where you get to look at very little and specific parts of what you ask for, and then they're going to potentially say yes or no. Here we needed them to open not only the stuff that was aired, but everything that was shot. So, if they're airing a 15-minute piece, they potentially shot 7-8 hours of footage, and we had access to all of that. So, yeah, this was a first for them.
Avi, your film, in one of the things I just love watching it is that you create a dialogue with Mike Wallace. You use his own tools of interviewing to reveal Mike Wallace. Can you tell us about that approach?
Well, yeah, that was the first approach that I wanted to do. Was I wanted to do a Mike Wallace interview with Mike Wallace. That was my first thought, but Michael was dead, obviously. So I kind of approached the archive materials as an opportunity for me to interview him through the archive materials. So what we did, we looked for all the interviews that Mike gave as an interviewee during his life, and we transcribed those. And then I just picked the questions that I want to ask Mike, and then I basically interviewed Mike through the archives. And while I was doing that, I did a similar move with the interviews that he did. Very early on, I read a story about Mike where he said that he's fascinated with people's weak spots. And when he goes into interviews, all he has to do is take those weak spots of his and frame it to others in the form of a question. And I felt like that's very revealing of Mike. And if I go through his interviews looking for moments where he reveals a character, and you can actually see Mike reflecting in that conversation, I'll be able to do an interesting kind of dual portrait of him interviewing while being interviewed as well.
You also articulate how he expanded the standards of journalism, but you also give us a portrait of him as a man and who he was. Can you tell us about balancing those two strains?
Yeah, well, it's tough. The thing about it for me was always kind of trying to get the professional and the career ahead of his personal life, because I really wanted to focus on that. But I also wanted, obviously, to reflect the man he was. And again, Mike has a beautiful quote in the movie where he says, interviews is a way to learn about others, but ourselves through others. And I felt that's the essence of what an interview is a chance for us to reflect on ourselves. So when I approached the film, I was just looking for moments where big themes are emerging in conversation, where an audience can actually sit down and reflect about themselves, but obviously also get a picture of who Mike was through those back and forth.
The choice of solely tell the story through archival footage, can you talk about that, Rafael?
Yes, I mean, this was something when Avi first came in and pitched me the project that he was very clear about, that he did not want to go out and interview people, did not want there to be talking heads. The dream, if we could do it, is to do it completely from archive, which is a very difficult thing, as you can imagine, because you can't just go out. You want to provide context at a certain point. You want to go a little bit deeper at a certain point. And you can't just go out there and find somebody and ask them the right question and have them say it. We had to work with existing materials. And Mike himself was not a very reflective guy, as you can hopefully, as you can see from the film. So, it was a very risky proposal, I would say, but something that we were very committed to, figuring out how to make it work. And as we were going through the process, it just became very clear that it was going to work. And it was going to be a lot to make it work, but we did.
Avi, can you tell us about that from your point of view, because we're used to seeing documentaries where the point of view of the filmmaker is imposed on the subject matter. Instead, you go from the inside out with the subject matter.
There's a scene in the film that I think kind of captures what our state of mind was there's a moment where Mike is talking with Oriana Fallaci, the Italian journalist, which is basically a female version of Mike Wallace with bad teeth. And that interview between them back and forth is just amazing. It's like Mike actually looking in the mirror. And all the questions is just basically questions to himself. But he basically confronts her about being an entertainer, which is what Mike was confronted his entire career. And she says, no, I'm an historian. And Mike says, you're not an historian. And she says she's an historian because journalists are historians that write history the moment it happens. And she says it's the best way to write history. And I think the film does kind of the same thing. Because we're staying only on the times, only on the way it was reported, and we're not giving this, retrospect thoughts from today, it kind of gives a much more clear notion of how it was experienced back then for audience and for Mike as well. And I think that's what we like so much about the approach of doing only archival film.
Yeah, then there's also like a sense of immediacy, a further sense of urgency.
Yeah, because you're watching the news in a way, you know what I mean? You're watching it as it unfolds. As we all watched it, those moments were delivered to us live and as it happened. And we wanted to stay on that feeling of the urgency and of how important journalism is in shaping people's minds.
There's two unprecedented pushbacks that you document in the film. The Westmoreland and the tobacco. Can you tell us about working on those two sections?
Yeah, you said it perfectly. There's two big pushbacks, I would say, like historical pushbacks. And one is in the 80s with Westmoreland, where we see the emergence of resistance to journalism in the form of libel suits. And then the second push is with Weigand, where we see an escalation of that, where instead of doing the libel suit, corporations are actually buying the news outlets and trying to inform from the top what is broadcast before it even being broadcast. So I think in those two cases, you can actually see the escalation of what today we see another level of escalation of people in power basically fighting journalism, because the purpose of journalists is to keep the system honest, is to flash out injustice, and a lot of the time those conflict each other.
I can only imagine the amount of research that went behind this project. Rafael, can you tell us how long that period was of gestation and the outline for the film?
So timeline-wise, I think we started working in earnest in, was it November 2017? I think we were just talking about that. And we started editing the film, I would say, in April, so about 5 months after that. So there was, a period of, and this was, we had a researcher, we had, Avi was, very meticulous and watching and reading transcripts, and we had tens of thousands of hours of footage to work with. And then process-wise, the edit went, I think, faster than any of us could have possibly imagined. We were
7 months, that's it, of just editing, pure editing.
Yeah, which, again, I think, when we were first talking about this project, there was, people in the room thinking that it's going to take us at least 2 years to, ever, put this stuff together. And I think that research period certainly helped, but I think things just came together. Avi had a very strong vision for the movie that we all kind of, were on board with, and it just came together, much quicker than any of us thought.
I think the hardest job about doing a documentary is usually the reframing of the story. How you're going to tell it in a way that's relevant to today, and what's the cinematic approach to it. And we had that kind of figured out early on. So once you have that, it's just a matter of going into the editing room and kind of playing with the materials until it kind of fits and the rhythm kind of clicks and everything. But the hardest job was done actually in November, like Rafi said, in those months of research and understanding what's the story about.
Were there, in the editing process, were there any surprises that you didn't see coming?
Well, I always joke, I said the movie was originally 9 hours long. We started off giving a lot of emphasis to his personal life. We had a scene about his wives and a longer scene about his son being, mysteriously killed in Greece. And a lot of more, like, Mike covered extensively the Middle East conflict, which I felt is a very important scene, and we had that scene. But at the end of it, we kind of decided to choose one angle. As a film director, I feel like the most important thing is to think what you're leaving out, what's not going to be in the film. And once we decided that we're going to do a career of Mike, and through that, the broadcast journalism story, then everything kind of felt not relevant anymore, and we just took it out.
The passage about the depression is so powerful and poignant, and I cannot, it doesn't escape the irony that here's a man who's determined to reveal the truth, and then when it comes to his own depression, he hides it. Can you tell us about that?
100%. This is for me the biggest revelation of this story, of this project. When I started, I didn't know anything about his insecurities, about the fact that he was prone to depression. All I knew of this John Wayne kind of character who's, this tough guy persona, who's unflinching. And to discover that underneath we're all kind of the same is for me a very compelling element of the story. But not only that, I think it humanizes Mike. I think when I started it was very hard to see Mike as a lovable character. And I think when you watch the film, there's something so compelling about him, because he would wake up every morning feeling insecure about himself. A lot of the time wouldn't want to get out of bed. And he would fight it every morning, every day. He would fight it. He would get up, and he would use that as a motivation tool for himself to prove to others. And I think that's just unbelievable as a strength of will, and just makes his whole story kind of be seen from a different angle.
And also the how you handle the fact that you have Mike Wallace, the person, and then the persona that he created. Can you?
I really believe that Mike played a role his entire life. And Morley Safer says it very early on in the film. He says, Mike had this terrible acne when he was a child. He had insecurities throughout his life. And I think very early on, he adopted this character, this Mike Wallace tough guy character, and he just played it his entire life. And I think that's amazing as a thought, but it's also an amazing tool for a person who kind of wants to transform his weak spots.
And Rafael, has the Wallace family seen the doc, and what has the feedback you've gotten?
Yes, so they did. It was actually a very kind of emotional and interesting experience for me and Avi when it was probably a week before the Sundance Film Festival. Chris had not seen the film, and we had asked Chris to come to Sundance with us and do Q&As and do some press with us for the film. And of course he said, well, I need to see it first. So yeah, I think a week before we were flying out, he flew to LA for a few hours, and we showed it to him in our I think it was like our our sound mix room, and having no idea, obviously we thought he was going to like it, but also there's a lot of things. It starts out with Mike saying, "Why is Fox News increasingly popular?" So at the end of the movie, Chris was very emotional. He loved the movie. He said that he felt like Mike would have loved this movie and would have been very proud of what we did. And then he stayed for probably an hour to an hour and a half just telling us stories about him and his dad. It just kind of brought out, like he just wanted to talk about their relationship and where it changed and where it was hard, and then just telling us funny stories, and it turned into a kind of really incredible experience for us.
How did it come about understanding how pivotal that his son's death was, Peter?
I mean, Mike talks about it in all the interviews. Mike tells that moment as the changing moment in his life. That's where he stopped doing all that. He was a jack of all trades before that. He did commercials and game shows and stuff like that. And he talks about this was the moment that he decided to be a serious journalist. But for me, you go through a film, you try to decipher the bigger themes of the character. And for me, the story of this film is really about the tough question. I kind of try to see how the question is evolving and changing throughout the film. And Mike was the master of the tough question. He invented the tough question. But something that people kind of miss is that he also asked himself those tough questions. And I always saw that moment as a moment where Mike turned the tough question on himself. A moment of such tragedy. I mean, finding your dead son, it's just like the worst experience you can have. And that experience can either make you or break you in a way. It can that energy can kill you, but it can also be a transformative force. And Mike took that moment and asked himself the tough question of, what are you doing with your life? Why are you wasting your life? And from those tough questions came a moment of reflection where he said, I don't want to do it anymore. I want to be a serious journalist. And I always felt like that scene is the core of what journalism is about and what a tough question is about. It's a way to reflect about a situation, and from that tough reflection, there may be growth and there may be a moment of realization.
Tagging on your statement about tough questions, we're living in a moment where audiences don't want journalists to confront them with tough questions and with uncomfortable truth. And then we have our current government taking advantage of that notion. Can you...
Yeah, listen, this is definitely a different time than what Mike experienced. Mike lived in an era of questions, and people wanted tough questions. People wanted to be educated. People wanted to be questioned about their beliefs. It seems like today we're in a very different time where people are just looking for affirmation of their beliefs and not to be questions about them. And we see it in news. People open up the news outlet that will give them what they believe is the truth, not what they might not know. So I think we're definitely seeing a situation today where the tough question is kind of fighting for its right to be asked in many ways. And I think the audience is very responsible for that situation, because journalism can exist if the audience doesn't demand tough questions. If the audience doesn't demand investigative journalism and doesn't watch it, then there is no market for it and they can give it. So it's kind of a cycle that we're seeing today, and it's a very dangerous cycle for democracy.
Mike Wallace, you point out in the movie, he says the country's getting worse. Do you?
I think he died, 7 years ago. I think back then it was even mildly better than it is right now. I think we're definitely seeing today the rise of strong armed leaders and totalitarians all over the world. And I think there's definitely a tipping point today where democracy is starting to be at question. And, I'm a cynical person, but journalism is important. There is a very important place for journalism in a democracy and in society, again, for the reason we just talked about, for keeping some sort of reflection and some sort of honesty in the system. And we're seeing today a situation where it's becoming more and more questionable.
It's a very chilling moment in your film when you show us the clip of Putin and his long
gangster stare, yeah. It looks like a mobster. I mean, in that moment, it's like, and the thing that's crazy about it, the Putin interview is from 2006. And it feels like it was shot yesterday. Nothing changed. It even got worse. So, yeah, I mean, that moment for me is just a very chilling moment. I agree.
You mentioned that journalism is under attack. What can we do?
I mean, again, like I said, I think we need to demand it. I think we need to demand tough journalists. We need to demand the tough questions. We need to be more vocal in our demands for getting the answers, because a lot of people don't give answers anymore today, and people are not holding them accountable. So I think I would say it's a two-way street. I think it's not just journalism needs to be tougher. I think the audience needs to demand it, and I think we all gotta be reminded, and I think the film does a good job of that, of what real journalism looks like and how important it is for society. If you look back at the 70s with Watergate and Vietnam War, journalism was a pivotal part in changing those events. And I think journalism has a very important role in society that we need to be reminded of.
You cover so much territory. Were you conscious of the 90 minutes that you wanted to be swift?
Always, yeah. Again, listen, I'm serious. This film could have been a 9-hour film. The materials is amazing. He interviewed every person who was of some importance in the 20th century. I wanted to be 90 minutes because I wanted to engage an audience. I think it's important to engage an audience. I think this kind of film exists to make a change in people's minds. So I wanted it to be in an appropriate length for people to kind of be watching it and taking away some stuff from it.
Well, thank you both, Rafael and Avi. Thank you for being here. Very fortunate.
Thank you.
Thank you.